Morning, everyone, and welcome back to the TIPS Forum 2021, day 2, that is. Thank you for joining us again. To those who are joining us for the first time, welcome, a warm welcome. As we all know, the forum theme this year is Reconstruction and Recovery, Rethinking Inclusive Industrialization in Response to COVID-19. Hi, Nuba. We were waiting for a couple of speakers to join, but let's get started in the interest of time, and we can include people, participants and speakers as we go along. So for today's session, or today, we've got 2 sessions as is reflected on the program. We're starting promptly now with session 3 on advancing regional trade and recovery for a post-COVID recovery. And the moderator for this morning's session is Ademola. So Ademola, over to you. I will leave it to you to introduce the speakers, and we will assist with any loading of presentations should you need our assistance. So over to you. Thank you, Ademola.
Thank you very good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 3. And just to say a big thank you to the TIPS team for such a wonderful opportunity to be on this session. I'm actually one of those first timers at the conference, and I found it as a very, very important and enlightening conference so far. Session 3, just has been mentioned, is on advancing regional trade and recovery post-COVID-19 recovery. And there would be 3 sessions, 3 papers that will be presented on this session. The first paper would be presented by Tlale Matseke, and the session would be, the paper will be on international trade as a driver of circularity in South Africa's post-COVID-19 recovery. The second paper would be presented by Gerald, Mfongeh and Yvonne Davis, which would be on trade complementarity in Africa. And the third would be on the regional impact of COVID-19, a firm level evidence for South Africa by Dr. Justin Visagie and Professor Yvonne Turok. Apologies if I didn't get any of the names correctly. So without further ado, I would want to do a quick introduction of Tlale Matseke, who is the Agriculture and Market Access Consultant at DNA Economics. Tlale Matseke is responsible for the Agriculture and Market Access component under the EU SA Partners for Growth program. She holds a BCom Economics degree from the University of Pretoria with a BCom Honors Agricultural Economics. Tlale has several years of professional experience in the agricultural sector with specific focus on business development, program coordination, as well as managing public-private sector partnerships to promote financial inclusion in agriculture. She led the establishment of a youth and women inclusion program at the Land Bank after working as a sector solution specialist in agribusiness banking at Absa Bank. Tlale also managed donor projects while working with National Farmers Organization across several countries in Southern Africa as a program coordinator at the Southern Africa Confederation of Agricultural Union. I welcome Tlale to start the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ademola, and good morning to everyone. So perhaps I can just start talking about giving the administrative aspects. My name is Tlale Matseke, and I worked on this paper with colleagues from the European Centre for Development and Policy Management. The initial paper was titled Circular Economy Opportunities in South Africa and EU Food Trade, the Case of Packaging. And I'm presenting this paper after it's now been amended for this audience and in response to the theme of today's conference, or this year's conference. So all of the views that are expressed in this paper are those of the authors, myself and the colleagues from ECPDM, and not the European Union or any other personal institution which is involved in this. And the reason is because this paper was written under the auspices under the EU-SA Partners for Growth project, which is an EU-funded project. So for the purpose of the presentation, I've amended the topic and it reads as follows: promoting circular practices in EU-SA trade. You can go into the next slide. This is just to give you a snapshot of what food trade looks like between South Africa and the EU. Over the last year, particularly in 2020, we recorded a 28% increase in agricultural exports to the EU. And I mean, this in the midst of the COVID pandemic is quite a good indication. And looking closer at what those products are, these are mostly your horticultural products, citrus, grapes, and wine. And these account for over 40% of all of the agri exports, which are coming from South Africa to the EU. There's a nice diagram on the slide there, which shows you exactly what these products are, which is coming from a publication called the Annual Digest, which has been produced under the program as well. And the key thing here is really that if we're going to pursue any recovery efforts, these really have to safeguard the performance of a sector like this, and by ensuring that we maintain access to a lucrative market, but also leveraging innovation as a lever of adaptation. Given the level of resilience shown in this industry, it's quite clear to us that we need to find a way to protect the industry. And given that the demands on the agricultural sector will continue to increase, this is really going to contribute to the recovery. Next slide, please. So in the 2021 EU Trade Policy Review, which took place earlier on this year, we got a sense that value chains which are circular in nature will be prioritized. And the European Commission also identified trade as a critical tool in the recovery from the COVID pandemic. And this is not surprising because coming from what we've seen in the European Green Deal and the related strategies that have been set out to address environmental challenges, we can see that there is a new way of doing things which the European economy is following. And this is really going to put it on the path to resource efficiency and to build competitiveness in circular applications. So although circular and sustainable, although the circular economy and sustainable approaches are becoming mainstream in South Africa, what is unclear to us is the capacity of South African firms and industries to respond to these new EU requirements, and really to understand how it is that they are responding to what we expect to happen in the EU as a result of the changing mandate. So the implementation of the Circular Economy Action Plan, as well as the Farm to Fork strategy, and other related EU policy instruments naturally would have a bearing on our horticultural industry. If you remember those figures that I've just said in the previous slide, we see that the sheer size of our agri exports and the number of value chains which are destined to the EU are particularly going to require a little bit more of our exporters. And that being said, the Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, along with the Fresh Produce Exporters Forum, are the ones that are jointly responsible for ensuring that exported products meet basic food safety and quality standards. And for example, this is in terms of product registration, in terms of quality control and phytosanitary measures, and also marking and labeling of different products. Our food safety standards in South Africa are well documented and adhered to by different industries and firms. Unfortunately, this global response to the threats of climate change and environmental degradation are necessitating new ways of responding to the climate crisis. And this is unfortunately having a bearing on food packaging and traded products. Agricultural commodities in particular agricultural products in particular, which are exported to the EU, will obviously compel South African exporters in the sector to fulfill new demands, which might be regulatory in nature. But what we're interested in finding out is what is the capacity of these exporters to respond to these requirements and also position themselves in a way that adapts to evolving requirements in these promising markets. And this is exactly where our analysis is going to be focused. Next slide, please. So we're seeing that circularity is being prioritized in the EU, and given that the circular economy minimizes, impacts on the environment and restricts and improves the environmental conditions without restricting economic growth or social and technical progress, we see that this approach actually represents numerous ways for us to have advantages in strengthening an economy, and particularly our industrial base, by establishing new businesses and providing citizens with a high quality product at the end of the day, and products that are designed to have an extended shelf life. So there are numerous requirements for chemicals, materials, foods, and other products that are being placed on the EU market. And the intention is for them to comply with relevant EU regulations and standards. These regulations are just guidelines and have been developed also to tackle the single-use plastic issue and that of non-recyclable materials, which are often used in these traded products. Just last month, there was a list of 10 single-use plastics that were banned in the EU, and this is long awaited. We see it as a milestone in the implementation of the EU Single-Use Plastics Directive. And what is interesting, and if you have a look at the pictures on the right-hand side, those are all products that are packaged in something in a polymer called expanded polystyrene, and this has been banned in the EU. Expanded polystyrene is a versatile packaging material which is used in countless applications to protect against mechanical damage during different stages of production and shipment. We use it widely in the agricultural sector for the packaging of fruit and vegetables. It's also being used in the fish industry, as you can see in the photo, and then also in the distribution of different inputs like seed trays. So products which are made from expanded polystyrene are no longer allowed in the EU. So the question is, to what extent does this impact exporters from South Africa, which are sending out grapes, wines, and other types of products which are making up so much of our trade balance? So what's important to note here is that we're aware of the EU sustainability development ambition, and it'll require us to adapt our supply chain. But what's important is that for all of these banned products, are there alternatives available, which we've seen is increasingly the case? And if so, to what extent are our exporters in South Africa aware of these implications? So there are several guiding questions which our research tackled. The most important ones are the recommendations at the end, but we've also gone through a couple of drivers as well as barriers which allowed us to understand exactly what is the status in South Africa of the EU, of the exporters into the EU. Next slide, please. Right, so we've got drivers that we looked at from the South African side and also in the EU. Most of these are policy level drivers. And on the South African side, those that we found to be quite important are the extended producer responsibility scheme, and these are all looked at in the context of their potential impact on trade. So given that EPRs are a core characteristic given that a core characteristic of any EPR policy is that it holds the original producer of a product responsible and accountable for the end of life externalities. We know that these are expected to positively impact South African exporters, since they'll be encouraged to produce more environmentally conscious design of packaging materials. We understand that the progressive developments in South Africa may build efficiencies in the export value chains, and that local companies that are required to improve design might be able to promote recyclability in products that find themselves going into the EU. There was also a white paper by the Department of Science and Technology, and this one assessed different measures under the Green Deal, which included a product passport, which is a great innovation that actually looks at how do we package, or what is the history of a package's information. And in this instance, they were looking at what are the different technological advancements that might not be legislated in South Africa, but actually would have an implication on South Africa's response to trade requirements with the EU. So what they've seen is that even though we might not actually have these requirements legally in South Africa, these would be an incentive for South African government to actually support a move in that direction. The other one is the master plan, the plastics master plan, and we know that there has been work done on the master plan, but it is still in draft form. So at this stage, we're not sure what this might mean for value chains that are destined for the EU. We have the South African Plastic Pact, which has been quite transformational. It was launched last year, and it basically convenes national government, businesses, municipalities, and other stakeholders, and basically looking at how do they create a circular economy for plastic packaging in conjunction with local initiatives. The other one is the South African Food Loss and Waste Voluntary Agreement, which is also quite important in terms of creating circles of practice, sharing best practices and knowledge exchange between South Africa and the EU. And this is quite helpful for a number of different stakeholders who even participated in a circular tour to the EU to learn about how different European organizations are implementing similar projects, and they were able to come back and implement different components which have helped them with their process. On the EU side, we've got the Packaging and the Packaging Waste Directive. At this stage, it's the EU policy framework doesn't stipulate strict product packaging requirements, and this means that at this stage there isn't anything in particular that mandates South African exporters to change their packaging requirements. But this is being revised and could change over the next 2 years. I think the date that we last saw was 2024. On the single-use directive plastics, and just important to note is that while these are all policy level drivers, in the EU, particularly private standards have been quite an important factor. And what we found is that despite what is being said by the single-use plastics directive, the private standards have played a very important role in ensuring that South African exporters meet the requirements of EU importers and retailers. We're all familiar with the Global Gap certification, and that is the most widely accepted certification for good agricultural practices. There also appears to be less emphasis on using recyclable or reusable materials in different private standards. And in actual fact, what happens is that the sustainable packaging has been promoted in the context of preventing food loss as a business concern rather than as a policy imperative. So over time, I guess we're waiting to see to what extent the divergence that we're seeing from EU importers communicating some of these requirements and will have on South African exporters. Some of the respondents that we interviewed in the study indicated that European importers or retailers haven't quite communicated a particularly urgent need for South African exporters to change their practices or to go beyond their current measures. And in fact, others have mentioned specific cases where there have been retailers that have already started implementing or rolling out private standards, but in the form of sustainability programs, and these could have a bearing on packaging, excuse me. So what's been interesting for us to note is that the type of product traded also seems to have a bearing on the level of awareness that the exporter has. So in the context of products traded in bulk, which is normally the case for the wine industry, these are pre-packed in the EU once they arrive, and this would typically involve secondary or tertiary packaging, which the South African exporter would only be responsible for. So to give a little bit of detail there, primary packaging is the one that contains the actual product that the consumer receives, and then you also have secondary packaging, which is the packaging that contains these multiple primary packages, which are being used to transport the primary packages. And then tertiary, of course, would be the big components which are involved in the shipment of these products. So if a producer is exporting products in bulk, they're only going to be looking at the tertiary products and maybe the secondary products. They wouldn't really be privy to what happens with the primary products. So they might not be aware of what the packaging requirements in the EU are because they're exporting in bulk. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of the barriers that we identified for this circular transition, the cost aspect has been a big one. The cost is seen as a massive deterrent to sustainable packaging. And if you look at the citrus industry, for instance, you've got biodegradable plastics and recyclable plastics, which use two different types of machines to be recycled. So if a pack house has an interest in becoming more sustainable, it would have to look at different requirements and invest in more than one type of machine. And it's not actually financially feasible. So what ends up happening is that the exporters would only focus on the costs which they feel are necessary for the business, and to a large extent they see packaging as a benefit to society rather than to the actual business, and beyond, of course, the functional need. There's also the fear of losing customer demand due to different types of packaging. There are certain products which are known for their packaging, and perhaps you have heavy branding on packaging that attracts consumers, always given high priority because the branding might entail using more ink or complex plastics. In the context of the wine industry, heavier bottles or different types of stickers that make them more difficult to recycle. So producers are worried about switching to those types of packaging because they feel that they might lose on a premium. On the point of the trade-off, this is also an important point that was quite interesting to us. We found that there seems to be a trade-off between food safety and the type of recyclable packaging. The primary concern here was that the food that arrives at the consumer is now, as a result of COVID, of course, is now having to be packaged in or to have more packaging on it. So previously, where there were gains in terms of laser barcoding and so on, that's no longer the case. So there seems to be a trade-off between food safety as well as the type of packaging which is used. And this might have a bearing on the horticultural sector, because they always tend to focus on protecting these really fragile products and then making sure that they arrive at the consumer in the right stage. Next slide, please. So what we found in this research is that South Africa is well positioned to lead a recovery which provides a win-win situation by both addressing the developmental challenges which we've got in the country through creating new opportunities such as jobs, industries and firms directly linked to the circular economy approaches that have been looked at today. But also there is also the fact that we need to look at these barriers, these potential barriers to trade, as an opportunity to create these markets rather than just as ways to comply. So safeguarding this industry requires us to adopt more innovative approaches to handling existing value chains. So there are a number of general recommendations which we had a look at, and these all have been pursued by the EU with South Africa. The first one, maybe I don't know if I have enough time to go through all of them individually, but I guess the key thing is that we found that the evidence from interviews suggests that the private sector actors in South Africa are more concerned with or are worried about the lack of opportunities for them to input in policy processes in the EU, and that they feel that they are bound to accept policy results which they have not had an input in. But I guess in this instance, what we found is that it's a matter of awareness raising, because the public consultations in the EU actually do invite South African stakeholders to be involved and to participate, except the consultation mechanism for EU policies might not be accessible to South African actors. So what has been done here is that through the EU SA Partners for Growth project, we found that there are opportunities to leverage this and to ensure that stakeholders are able to participate in public consultations and various feedback mechanisms. So that was the key thing. We found that visibility is quite an important aspect, because it has implications on how policies are being accepted beyond the European Union. On the point of the specific recommendations, what we found is that, there are some really interesting government and private sector initiatives which are quite important in facilitating an enabling network. So the key one here was that we had the Western Cape Department of Agriculture, and through a seed funding initiative which is provided by the European Space Agency, they were able to actually access information for local farmers by providing smart satellite data on suitable circular economy agricultural practices at farm level. Now, when we look at circular economy in the context of this paper, we just focused on packaging, although it's important to note that there are other applications such as good agricultural practices, climate smart agricultural practices, as well as water management and other aspects on the farm. So the key thing here would be for us to understand that even though there have been different ways of enabling government to work with stakeholders, the provincial government has found very good ways to guarantee inclusive growth and inclusive support by securing different types of resources that crowd in other kinds of financing, and that's been quite transformational for farmers on the ground. So while the paper only focuses on the issue of sustainable packaging, we really see this as an important factor to consider, because opportunities for circularity and other stages of food production are important to improve the circularity of value chains that could potentially be at risk of not reaching the markets that we find are important for circular recovery. So we would like to find ways to promote circularity throughout the food chain in South Africa to assist producers actually seize opportunities in the export market provided. And this is exactly what the paper aimed to do. And I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to welcome any questions after the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tlale. Please, we will take questions after the three presentations. I guess you could drop your questions in the Q&A section. Sethetho, Thank you so much for that very enlightening presentation on the circularity conversation, which I would, kind of complicates the challenge we have currently with COVID-19 recovery, but also presents, just as you've said, presents an opportunity to build back better, build back stronger. And really, thanks for highlighting the requirements. And I also look forward to hearing, what so receiving the questions. I have one or two already, but yes, we'll take that after the next presentation. Now, the next presentation would be a joint one by Yvonne Davis and Gerald Mfongeh, both of the Industrial Policy Advisory Unit of the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition. They will be presenting on trade complementarity in Africa. This is indeed one very important subject that could help us build back better. And we look forward to getting their perspectives from their paper, which is indeed very, very eye-opening on the subject. Over to you, Gerald and Yvonne.
Colleagues, good morning. I'm just going to get straight to it. I'll skip the contents page and then jump onto the introduction. Let's just open it up nicely. Okay, so the objective of the paper is to look at the level of trade complementarity among African countries. We examine complementarity while at the same time taking into account major developments to improve inter-regional trade through the African Continental Free Trade Area. And we argue that while this is a welcome step, what may be needed will include a change to the export structures of members within the bloc and how complementary the exports are to one another. We further then propose that efforts need to be made to then diversify African exports in order to improve the match between supply and demand among member states. We also have to mention the focus and dependency on primary commodity exports, which results in a lack of diversity and potential mismatch then between what most member states demand and what is supplied. So this brings us to our research question, which is to investigate how complementary the export baskets are of the top 10 exporters in Africa. Also, we pose two main questions. Are trade barriers the major challenge to higher levels of trade and development in Africa? And what does the level of trade complementarity among selected countries then imply for policies to promote structural transformation and intra-African trade under the AFCFTA? To clarify, we use the top 10 exporters in Africa because they make up roughly 70% of total African exports. And just briefly, the methodology we use to investigate the level of complementarity includes three indices, which is the Trade Complementarity Index, the Trade Intensity Index, and the Export Diversification Index. We use these indexes to determine the level of importance of the export baskets of the top 10 exporters in Africa to each other. I'll just move on to the next slide. Yeah, so we've compiled a statistical background of the top 10 exporting African countries based on 2018 figures reported in the World Bank's Development Indicators database. And what we've included in the background table is the trade and production information of the countries over a 10-year period. I won't mention all the findings, but we thought it important to just mention a few. So South Africa is the largest exporter in Africa with a total export value of $110 billion in 2018, which represents about 17% of total African exports. Nigeria, as the largest economy in Africa, only accounted for nearly 10% of African exports, only slightly more than half South Africa's share. The lowest exporter on the list is the DRC, with exports of 16 billion, which represents a share of 2.6% of total exports of the continent. The major difference between the top and lowest in export share among the top 10 shows us the difference in development among these countries as sources of single primary products, especially in the petroleum sector, which we found actually dominates several of the exports of other countries on the list. Some issues that stand out from the data in the table is that Nigeria has the largest GDP and population, but its GDP per capita is among the lowest. We mention GDP coupled with the manufacturing value and a share of GDP, which also gives us then an indication of the level of development. So besides Angola, Nigeria's share of manufacturing is the lowest, although in real values it stands at 42.5 billion. And when we look at GDP, besides South Africa leading the way, the North African countries have the highest GDP per capita values, with Algeria leading the way, followed by Morocco and Egypt. The income levels of North African countries appear to then be boosted by their high manufacturing shares of output compared to those of the other African countries. Algeria is the largest producer of manufacturing goods in Africa at a total of 56 billion. What this tells us then is that despite having a reasonably high manufacturing share of national output at 18%, some of these countries have the lowest GDP per capita, and this is most likely due to high revenues from oil exports. And moving on. So we all know that the AfCFTA is seen as an important catalyst for inter-regional trade in Africa. Hence, our next area of focus is the potential for higher trade through the AfCFTA. Here we acknowledge the benefits of the AfCFTA as a trade agreement, which in itself is identified as a contributor to improved trade relations. However, we also acknowledge in the paper the importance of the fundamental nature and structure of economies, which in this case, and analyzing our sample of countries, point to the vast understructures needed for improved industrialization and beneficial trade. So what do we then mean by complementarity, trade complementarity in this specific context? And how do we see this playing out in Africa, specifically among the sample countries? So as stated in the paper, the trade complementarity refers to the extent to which one country's export patterns aligns to the import patterns of another country. Simply put, it basically asks whether what a country can offer another country is actually what the partner country needs, and is there a match to what its trading partner needs. We then argue that the success of the AfCFTA also hinges then on whether or not African countries have complementary trade structures. Okay, and then we take the issue of full implementation a bit further. And when we look at complementarity, the AfCFTA and the current production structures and patterns of African countries, we see that a fully implemented sub-regional agreement would boost trade only slightly by 3% for some West African countries under current production structures. And when the complementarity figures are looked at for the entire continent, the patterns are similar. This then means that only implementing the AfCFTA may not then boost levels of trade significantly. So what else can we do then? We try to answer this question by saying that the AfCFTA plus other measures, including how complementary and diversified our African economies are, will determine the success of the agreement. We conclude then that while there are pockets of complementarity and diversification, what you will see in the next part of the presentation is that most countries we've studied have not changed the structure of their exports by much. Similarly, the levels of trade complementarity index overall is low and only partially complementary according to the numbers. And the same applies to the levels of trade intensity and export similarity, which will be expanded in the next part of the presentation. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Gerald. Gerald?
Hi, morning. Thanks very much, Yvonne. Good morning, everyone. So as Yvonne has said, while there are so many factors that determine the level of intra-regional trade in any region, including economic factors, policy variables, geographic location, this paper focuses narrowly on the issue of trade complementarity. And so what we are really looking at is that all the other factors are important, but the issue of how, complementary the exports of one country are to the imports of its trading partners is really also a very important factor, which will determine by how much trade levels are able to be boosted by the African Free Trade Agreement. And so what we tried to do was to look at the 3 different indices, which will give us an idea of just how important the top 10 exporting countries in Africa are to each other. So we looked at trade complementarity index, the trade intensity index, and export diversification index. So these indices, we got them from the World Integrated Trade Solutions database. So with the trade complementarity index, what you're really looking at is trying to measure the extent to which a country's exports match the imports of a trading partner. So are they compatible, basically? Because it has been suggested for a while that African countries tend to export similar products. So what we tried to do was to answer that question on whether the exports are too similar that it will be difficult for them to buy products from each other. And with the trade complementarity index, it ranges from 0 to 100, with 0 basically saying that there is no possibility of trade because they are just not compatible, and a value of 100 saying that they are extremely compatible, and which means that trade can be boosted. With the trade intensity index, so you're basically looking at how intense one country trades with another, and you're comparing that with the average world trading average, essentially. So, for example, if country A exports, a certain percentage of its total exports to country B, if it is higher than what the share of the world export to that country is compared to the total world exports, then you would say that country B's trade with country A is very intense, essentially. And then with the export diversification index, it is a very important one because more diversified countries tend to have a better possibility of trading with one another. And that's because they have a lot more options in terms of the products that they export. And as we will see in the numbers next, the more industrialized countries in Africa, like South Africa, Egypt, Morocco, tend to have more trade with the other countries. And that's because they just have much more products that they can, export to the other countries. And with the export diversification index, so lower the index is, the more diversified the economy is. So you want it to be as close to 0 as possible. And an index between 0.15 and 0.25 shows a moderately concentrated market, and above 0.25 shows that it is highly concentrated. So next slide, Yvonne. So we looked at 2 years over a 10-year period, and that's 2009 and then 2018. So the first thing we noticed was that there was not a lot of change between 2009 and 2018 in terms of, improvement in terms of these indices. So for the trade complementarity index, which, as we said, looks at how compatible two trading partners are. So you'll see from the table that for most African countries, it is below 50, which indicates that they are not compatible. And some are really so low that they're in the teens. For example, you see a country like Nigeria with a very low complementarity index with the other top 10 countries across the board. And the average will then be 14.52, which is really low when you compare these numbers to average numbers for Asia and Europe, in the Asian countries, you're looking at about 73%, 73, and for Europe, it's about 86. So when you look at the numbers for Africa, you can see that they're not compatible or not as compatible as required in order for them to be able to trade more. So an observation is that the countries that are more diversified on the continent tend to have higher complementarity indices. So if you look at South Africa, for example, it's much higher than countries like Nigeria, for example. If you look at Egypt, for example, as well, it's also much higher. Yvonne, please go to the next slide, which is the 2018. Yeah. So you'll see that the more developed countries tend to have higher indices. South Africa, 49.23 on average, Egypt, 50.23, and Tunisia as well, 49.94. And the countries that are not as industrialized, you see that they tend to have very low complementarity indices. And you look at Angola, for example, which, as we will see later, it only exports, over 90% of its exports are made up of one product, which is fuels. So the countries that are sort of least industrialized or less industrialized tend to have very low compatibility in indices when compared to the more industrialized countries. All right, so let's move on to, so with the trade intensity index, so this ranges from 0 to infinity, basically can get us, it can get as high as, infinity. So, but if it is over 100, it is considered that there is intensity, there's trade intensity, which is more than what the average world trade is. So again, you'll see that there are pockets of sections where there is trade intensity, but there are a lot of sort of bilaterals that are also very low. So one thing we notice as well is that the countries that tend to have high trade intensities are those that export, resource, mainly primary products like fuels. So if you look, for example, countries like Angola, at certain points, you'll see that it has its high trade intensity with South Africa at 660.
Hi, Gerald, please, you have just about a minute left.
Okay, cool. So, so what we basically saying is that trade intensity it also tends to be low, but there are some areas where it's high for only very specific reasons. Okay, please move to the next slide, Yvonne. So, yeah, the next one. So export diversification index. So as we've said, this index, the lower it is, it shows that the country is more diversified. So you'll see that the most diversified country in Africa is South Africa. And then you have Egypt as well, Morocco and Tunisia. And the other countries tend to be highly concentrated. Okay, let's move forward. And then when you look at the number of markets that these countries compete in, you can see again that South Africa is the only country with over 4,000 markets where it competes in, when you have other countries like Libya and Angola, Nigeria that compete in very few markets. Okay, let's move on. So when you compare that with other countries, Sorry, please move past this slide, Yvonne. Yeah, so when you compare with other developing countries, you can see that they have a lot more markets where they're competing in. So that provides more options for their trading partners. And there is a higher possibility of increasing trade in those regions than it is in Africa. Okay, let's move on. So this table kind of brings what we've been saying together. So if you look at the column fuels, you'll see that in the top 10 exporting countries in Africa, 4 of them, 90% of their exports are made up of fuels. So that's Nigeria, Angola, Libya. So Libya, Angola, Algeria, and Nigeria. So 4 of them export 90% of their exports are made up of fuels. So there is not a lot of possibility for them to increase trade with other African countries because they're exporting one product essentially. So, and then when you look at Ghana, over 30%, and Egypt over about 24%. So it provides, it gives an indication of sort of an export structure that is highly concentrated and not a lot of room for trade trade levels to be increased. All right, final slide. So essentially, research by Longo and Sekert has shown that at the as already mentioned, with the current trade structures, intra-trade in Africa may not increase by much unless we see more investment in infrastructure and industrial development in Africa, which would be meant to increase, to diversify African economies so that more products can be, supplied without the assistance of third-party countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yvonne and Gerald. This is indeed one very concerning presentation, I must say, that there seems to be a lot of hope and maybe, let me say, false hope of the fact that AFCFTA is going to solve a lot of problems, but definitely we have a lot of work to do before then. So we would move very quickly to the last set of presenters, Dr. Justin Visagie and Professor Yvonne Turok, both of the Human Sciences Research Council, that will be presenting on regional impacts of COVID-19, a firm level evidence for South Africa. Over to you, Justin.
Thanks very much, and pleasure to be at the TIPS Forum this year. Just let me know if you can't hear or see my presentation. Great stuff. So I'll do my best to present in 10, not 15. And I'm talking today about regional impacts of COVID-19, looking at some firm level data. So just a background, we know that COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on the South African economy, shrinking GDP by 7% in 2020. And the lockdown and related restrictions which were applied in that year were mostly done differentially by sector, but pretty uniformly by place. And when you think about the country with vastly different density profiles and probably risks of contagion, you can see that this was a sort of severe national impact. So even though there was this national impact and it was applied uniformly to all places, we wouldn't imagine that all firms operating in different parts of the country are equally equipped to cope with the shock. So the question is quite simple. It's what has been the impact of the pandemic on different parts of the country? We've seen from a lot of household evidence, like the NIDS-CRAM, that the pandemic has tended to amplify spatial inequalities, whether between rural and urban areas, or even within urban areas between poorer communities and more affluent suburbs. But what has what does the data suggest about firms and the economy specifically? And we're interested in thinking through our larger, more diversified city economies, i.e. the Gauteng city region, more resilient than smaller city and town economies. So just to briefly make the point that, you know, space really matters, and I think hasn't been considered enough in our national growth dynamics. This just shows you a panel on the left, the distribution of the economy by province, and you can see that Gauteng is more than a third of the national total. And if you add Gauteng, KZN, and Western Cape together, you know, you get about 2/3 or about just under 65% of the national total. So our production very concentrated in those 3 provinces. And in fact, the bottom 6, I think it is the same size as Gauteng alone. But when you look at the pattern over time, and if you index growth, and for the years that we have data, 1995 up to 2018, you can see over here that actually the 3 largest provinces, Gauteng, Western Cape, and KZN, they're the ones that have actually grown relatively faster. And the 3 smallest provinces, Northern Cape, Free State, and Northwest, have grown slower. So actually the sort of pattern of the production is actually, if anything, becoming stronger over time. So it's important that we consider how these regional dynamics play themselves out. We use data from a World Bank Enterprise Survey for South Africa, and just to say that it was done in 2020. It's a representative sample of formal firms in the non-agricultural economy, and the period is quite long. It's from December 2019 through to February 2021. Obviously, fieldwork was difficult in that 2020 year. And note that there was a special COVID module, and firms that were surveyed early on in December 2020 were then called back. So everyone was covered. The coverage regionally is for Gauteng, KZN, Western Cape, and Eastern Cape. And the total sample is 1,097 firms. So an important new source of firm level data. And you can just see some of the details. So what we're essentially looking at is the sort of urban economy, because we're excluding agriculture and mining. We also exclude non-tradables like government services, education, etc. Also, it was formal firms with 5 or more employees. Great. So we organized the sort of regional evidence using a different sort of typology. And that's because we're not just looking at provinces here, even though the data was set up in that way, but we think it makes more sense to look at the sort of scale of different urban areas. So what we can do is use, we had access to geomasked coordinates. And so we applied the sort of settlement structure from the Global Human Settlements layer to divide firms into 3 categories, either in the Gauteng city region, we've got 400 firms, or in the Western Cape, Eastern Cape, or KZN metros, that's 478 firms, or in the remainder of the country, which is smaller cities and towns. And we've got 219 firms. You can see at the panel on the right is from other work we've been doing on agglomeration in Africa. But looking specifically at the relationship between city size and productivity per worker for South Africa, you can see that it maps quite tightly in terms of both the manufacturing and service economy. So as cities get bigger, they do seem to play an important role in terms of productivity. This just shows you a picture of the Gauteng city region. You can see here from the Global Human Settlements layer how we sort of have developed these different classifications for different cities, and you can see here's all the dots of the firms sampled in that area. Great. So what does some of the data say? The first thing to say is that these different spatial typology have different sorts of firms in them. So if you look at the Gauteng city region, with a split between manufacturing and services, you can see that the majority is in the service economy. And importantly, you can see that the construction industry is at about 20% of all firms. Whereas if we move through to the metros, you've got a sort of similar, the other metros, you've got a similar composition, except accommodation and hospitality related services are a lot bigger. And the construction industry seems to be, firms represented by the construction industry seem to be a lot smaller. And then even more dramatically, if we look at smaller cities and towns, you can see manufacturing industries only a very small segment of these smaller places, which makes sense, and services much larger. I think that those related to hospitality look overrepresented at 52% of the firm sampled in these smaller towns and cities. But I still think that it's fair to say that these smaller places are a lot more sensitive to tourism, and that obviously has implications for the pandemic. And in terms of firm size overall, you can see that it's in Gauteng city region in particular where the profile is quite different. We've got a higher share of large firms of 100 plus employees, and a higher share of those medium firms of 20 to 99 people. So in Gauteng, more firm size seems to be bigger. Okay. Also, in terms of connectivity and trade, you can see the level of a number of firms reporting that they're exporting is low in general for the World Bank Enterprise Survey, but it is significantly higher for Gauteng firms at about 10%. Interestingly, when you look at whether firms had a foreign presence in terms of a subsidiary or a branch in a SADC country, again, we see almost 50% of firms in Gauteng saying yes to this question, where it was much, much smaller in the rest of the country. So greater connectivity there. In terms of the actual impact of COVID-19, the question asked, did the establishment close temporarily due to the COVID-19 outbreak? And you can see that there's only slight differences between our different regions, and firms in the Gauteng city region were slightly less likely to have temporarily closed, but the differences are fairly nominal. They become a little bit more apparent when asking the question, did your sales increase, remain the same, or decrease compared to the same month in 2019, and you can see here that firms in the Gauteng city region were less likely to say that their sales had decreased at 80, which is about 80% compared to 90% saying that they had decreased. So evidence pointing at slightly greater impact in the smaller cities and towns. Impact on employment was fairly steady across permanent workers. So you can see most firms were, I think, buying time, and employment remained the same. But having said that, you can see about a fifth of firms having to lay off permanent workers. And this was pretty much similar across all the different regions. However, when it comes to temporary workers, you can see in the Gauteng city region, it was significantly more likely that firms there would decrease their share of temporary workers. So it seemed that a different response there. One of the key mechanisms is the ability for firms to then go online to increase or to try and mitigate against the shock. And you can see a marked difference here again. So in the Gauteng city region, 75% of firms saying, yes, we did try and go online to increase our business due to the COVID outbreak, whereas this was a smaller share and a similar share between smaller towns and cities and the rest of the metros. Firms also reported different obstacles being faced. And just to note, one sort of puzzle in the data here is that in terms of electricity, I'm assuming load shedding, firms in Gauteng were far more likely to report this being a huge issue. So even though it's still a big issue in the Western Cape, KZN and Eastern Cape metros and smaller towns and cities, the share is far smaller, where it just completely dominates in the Gauteng city region. Interestingly enough, access to finance was a much bigger issue in these other places. And there's another question in the survey that directly asks, is access to credit and finance a problem? And we see the same pattern in the data. So it seems that the firms in the Gauteng city region seem to have less problems with finance, but more problems with load shedding. I'm not need to think about that. The policy most needed to support businesses over this crisis period, you can see that wage subsidies were sort of a common call. It makes sense because most firms were not, it was the minority of firms who were actually laying off employees. Okay, so we've sort of run out of time, so I won't touch on labour market issues, just to say that in the Gauteng city region, firms seem to be able to deal with the labor environment more comprehensively, and reporting it being less of an issue, both in terms of the labor regulations, as well as in terms of getting access to scarce skills. So pointing to the larger labor pool. So my last slide. So we see here striking spatial differences in the industry composition, size, productivity, wages, and international trade between these different agglomerations. The pandemic has had a huge impact, and we see it in sales and turnover, but the evidence does suggest that smaller cities and places are less able to cope. Firms in Gauteng City seem to be more resilient in terms of the ability to digitize, to engage with the labor market, in terms of their tradability and market reach and access to finance. And so a key question then is this resilience just because of firm level size and sector differences, as I started off with? And I think the answer to that is yes, that definitely has a big impact, but it's more than that and deeper than that. It's also got to do with the agglomeration in Gauteng and the fact that firms based there seem to be able to become more productive. And it talks to the need to look at the ecosystem that is supporting firms as an important part of accelerating their performance. There are key differences and obstacles and policy reforms needed between regions, and I suppose it justifies the need for a more place-sensitive approach and sensitivity in terms of how we apply certain restrictions on different parts of the country and the economic impact that it can have. So that's it from me. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Justin, for that very clear presentation. And I guess there are already some questions popping up. We do have about 5 minutes to the end of the session, but I would want to crave your indulgence to take a few minutes, maybe like 3-4 additional minutes to address some of the questions. So our first question for the first presenter, Tlale, is that is biodegradable plastics presently less favored as compared to transition to circular economy globally or only in the EU? Please feel free to come off mute. Yeah.
Great. So the focus in the EU is really to have a sustainable plastics economy. And indeed, bio-based products do have a role to play. Currently, there is no EU law which is in place which applies to biodegradable or compostable plastics. But this is subject to change. And I guess the reason for this is because with biodegradable plastics, they are an option in a circular transition, but it's all based on whether or not they actually lead to genuine environmental benefits. So in some cases, biodegradable plastics are understood to be more sustainable, but they typically only degrade under specific conditions. And these aren't easily found in the natural environment. And that's the reason why we end up finding so many of them in marine environments. And the same can be said about compostable plastics because they might not be suitable for home composting. So yes, indeed, these are viable options. And I think with a little more research and clear communication, transparent communication with consumers, there might be a good opportunity for us to understand what their role to play is.
Great, thank you very much. I think a lot of questions have been asked to that would need to be addressed by Yvonne and Gerald, and I'll take maybe just 2 of them or 3, and maybe the others we would be able to answer and post also with the recordings of the session. So the first that I would ask would be, what are the opportunities of product diversification versus duplication and selling to each other the same product? Is there data of what each country in Africa is producing in order to increase compatibility or to complement each other? And if I may add to that, it would just be maybe just to ask, beyond what is currently being exported now, are we seeing any capabilities to do more or to be able to attend to export more, maybe with some more, just as you've suggested, with some more coordination? Are there potentials that we're seeing within the countries that were studied? Over.
Hi, thank you very much. If you look at the last chart or table that we had in the presentation, it states clearly the composition of each country's exports. And as it indicates, most, at least 5 or 6 countries have a heavy component of fuels, which doesn't really leave a lot of room for other products, and which, as we think, is part of the reasons why intertrade levels in Africa are very low. So yes, we do have that data. It is included in the presentation, which gives an indication of what each country is exporting. I see. So we do not disagree with what you are saying. As a matter of fact, we left out part of the presentation, which was the first research question we looked at, due to the fact that we only had 15 minutes. And we actually did conclude that a trade agreement or reducing tariffs alone does not, there's no guarantee that that would increase trade levels. So we did actually have that conclusion as part of the research. We also think that the trade agreement should be development focused, and the focus should not be on reducing tariffs, but doing the legwork of the infrastructure development and coordinating industrialization and development efforts across the continent. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. I see that you've also taken the opportunity to address the question from Saul. Justin, I would be taking 1 or 2 questions from the chat box. I wanted to check what happened to mining and small towns. I know that many small towns don't have mining, but there are still quite a few that are heavily dependent on the mining sector, but that does not come through in your survey.
Thanks. Yes, I think mining is a critical part of our economy, and particularly in these smaller places. The World Bank Enterprise Survey, however, excludes the mining sector, so they are excluded in this sort of sample frame. But just to make a general comment, that we're looking at a survey here of firms, and it's about just over 1,000 firms in total. And so, you know, that limits the extent to which you can slice and dice things. And I think it points towards a need for us to develop a more robust evidence base about our firms in this country, so that we can understand their specific needs and how these intersect along a whole range of different criteria, from sector like mining and through to space, as we've tried to do here. Thanks.
So just one more question and we would wrap up. Justin, there's a question from Neva saying, hi, can you distinguish between production structure and nature of companies in historic labor sending regions and historic RSA? Mostly we find the former is much more dependent on public services, which are not in the survey.
So I suppose it's to reflect a similar comment back to Neva, in terms of, you know, how much we can actually do with this database in terms of picking up those specific sorts of dynamics. I mean, I think the justification for excluding the public sector is that it's, you know, seen as non-tradable, although clearly its growth over time and then its contraction has a big influence in certain parts in certain places. But I wonder if I can ask Ivan to make any quick comments, because he is also on the panel. Ivan, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, thanks, Justin. I think the first point is I'm a bit surprised that the comments are all about, you know, mining towns and historically impoverished areas. You know, the survey is showing that the large diversified agglomerations have performed better, and you know, that's critical that we recognize not success but relative good performance, and not just focus on the lagging regions all the time. So we must discuss, you know, what lies behind this relatively strong performance. and see whether we can, build on that. The other comment, we can, although these particular sectors, mining and public services, are excluded, one can still look at these areas where the data is available. It's limited, as Justin said, to 4 provinces. So it does exclude the predominantly mining provinces of Mpumalanga, Northwest, and so on, Limpopo. So the number of mining dependent towns would be pretty small. But overall, there's also a question about the difference between productivity and employment. The survey includes information on output and employment rather than productivity. And there is an apparent anomaly between output and employment over time. But I think the reason for that is it's quite a short time scale that we're looking at, over a period of some months. And therefore, businesses won't immediately lay off workers if they experience a loss of output. It's a critical point that firms seem to hang on to their permanent employees in the hope that the pandemic would be short-lived. They don't want to lose key workers and then have to recruit again when things pick up. So you wouldn't expect, I think the key point, you wouldn't expect a direct relationship between output and employment over a short period of time.
Great, thanks a lot, Yvonne. I think we could wrap up now, or maybe I could just take this last one, even though already you spoke to it, and that's the issue around job losses. But I think beyond job losses, which for the reduction, it would be great to also understand what your thoughts are on the impact of exports and the companies that had subsidiaries outside of South Africa on the output. Is this seen as you didn't come back to this in the conclusion, and it was one of the striking differences where we saw a lot of significant difference in Gauteng. Yvonne, you want to take that, or Justin?
Okay, well, I'm gonna just make a closing comment. Thanks so much to say that I think the main point that we're showing here is that there are these sort of key differences between these different places, and we need more research to get to the bottom of them. It certainly seems, from a tradability perspective, Gauteng much bigger, more diversified, and more connected, probably to the rest of the country, but certainly in terms of to the rest of Africa. Whereas a lot of the smaller towns seem to be struggle to access finance, etc. So there are some interesting questions where you could explore service delivery. I see that coming up in the chat, and whether that's having an impact. So I encourage any researchers out there to go and look for the World Bank Enterprise Survey, have a look at the questionnaire, and to see, explore some of these constraints. But we certainly think that productivity at the moment in South Africa is very correlated to the size of the region, and so we need to find a way to support lagging regions and then to further increase the productivity of the Gauteng City region in particular. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Maybe one sentence each of final comments from Yvonne, Gerald, and Tlale.
Yeah, thank you, Ademola. Yeah, I would just say that this exercise is it's a work in progress. We're definitely going to keep working on the paper and expand it as much as we can, because this exercise itself has been very useful to us in identifying some areas that we can take forward in our research. So yeah, we're gonna keep at it and just to expand the paper, but then hopefully make a bigger contribution to not only the forum but research around the area. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerald.
Thanks, Ademola. So this has been an eye-opening exercise for us as well. We always sort of knew that trade levels in Africa were low. When you look at it, standing at about 17%, when you compare to Europe at over 60%, Asia at about 50-something%. So you start to understand more why it is that these trade levels are so low. It's not the only reason, obviously. You have other major determinants, but the issue of compatibility certainly is an important one, and I think one that should be given closer attention. Thanks.
Thank you. And last but not the least, Tlale.
Thanks, Ademola. Perhaps I'll just take this time to reflect on a quote that Professor Golden from the University of Oxford shared recently, when he says that he doesn't like the language of bouncing back because it implies as though we're continuing down the same track, and that we need to look at this being the pandemic as a wake-up call, not a reset. So the circular economy indeed has a lot of opportunities for us to build back sustainably, and looking at novel ways of doing this and leveraging innovations like the circular economy is definitely something that we have at our fingertips, and we should leverage it through trade. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks to all the speakers. It has indeed been very, very enlightening. And thanks to everyone for the great questions and the discussions in the chat room. At this point, we're at the end of the third session, and I'll hand over back to Baba.
Hi, thanks, Ademola. Thank you for moderating very well. And thank you to, again, all our speakers. We are going to take a short comfort break, slightly into the last fourth session. So let's all return at 11:35 for our last session of the day. And I see Basani, you're here. Basani will be moderating our last session for the day. See you all soon.